So my interest in this, it seems like this is really in the spirit of theological dark web, which is talking about stuff that mainstream, Christianity or mainstream theology doesn't want to discuss. And you mentioned the near-death experience thing, which we'll go into detail on. There are near-death experiences recorded in the New Testament where people like the Apostle Paul or Luke recording the account of Stephen when he was being stoned, they're actually getting their theology from encounters with heaven. And the thought that somebody could have an encounter with God today that would have theological implications, well, that runs contrary to, sola scriptura, that we get our theology strictly from the Bible. And I'm open to having discussions about that. I'm not saying, for the sake of this conversation, I'm not going to take a stand one way or another. I may have opinions about that. But I think that what you have to say might be really interesting because it might actually have theological implications. And I'm kind of curious to see where that goes. I'm kind of hoping that you'll say something that can't be ignored, but that's also offensive to, mainstream Christianity.
All right.
So introduce yourself.
All right. So my name is Leifryan Kirkpatrick. And as you mentioned, I have a near-death experience that I have gone through electrocution. And so I guess I live life differently because of that. I literally experience the daily, moment-to-moment reality through a new lens because of my near-death experience.
How do you spell your first name?
It's Leifryan.
Leifryan?
Leifryan.
Yeah. Leifryan. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that Scottish? Or?
It would be like Norwegian.
Norwegian. Okay. Yeah. Interesting name. Mm-hmm. And you have a book, right?
I do.
Is it available? Amazon?
It is available on Amazon.
Okay. Yeah. What's the title of your book?
It's Walking on the Ocean of Life.
Oh, and it's right here.
It's right here.
Oops. Ta-da! It looks like this.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. It's a hook to get people to do podcasts. I'll plug your book.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had my own kind of near-death experience. Not the out-of-body sort, but I was almost killed, and it caused me to rethink, the fragility of life and that kind of stuff. So I definitely get, how your life can be radically changed, how you can have a massive paradigm shift when you're confronted with your own mortality. And then if you have some kind of a otherworldly encounter with, a supernatural entity or something like that, that can, just solidify that, or maybe even bring even deeper, paradigm shifting without a clutch kind of pop in the mind.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so tell me about your experience. You got electrocuted, right? So you probably need to give me the mundane.
Right. And so, like, in my book, this is what I ended up writing about, is I've had kind of 3 life-changing experiences, one of which is a near-death experience. And then another part, half of the book, is about the reality that I currently operate under and how to explain that. But the near-death experience through electrocution was an extended. So I ended up being electrocuted arm to arm with a furnace, and so the fan motor in the furnace was brand new and failing right in front of my face. In that process, the thing became live, and I happened to be hanging on the ground, which was connected to the metal building, and so then basically the fan motor was using me as a pathway, and so arm to arm, I was being electrocuted by this failing motor for at least 30 seconds before I died.
So you're completing the circuit. Was the fan actually spinning?
It was. Yeah, so it
So
was full-fledged 3/4 horsepower motor with a squirrel cage type fan, and basically like my hand touched the house, my forearm touched the housing, and then my hand went inside the fan, the running fan, and I wasn't able to let go. My muscles clenched onto the thing to where as I was grabbing onto the running squirrel cage, it shaved off the ends of my fingers. And then the housing was burrowing into my palm and created a big cavity where the electricity chewed up my palm. And I clenched onto that running fan hard enough that I stopped the motor from running. And then the motor just sitting there, just melting right, like at my fingertips.
Yeah. This is why, bearded Norwegians are not an approved type of wiring.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So they kind of that whole process of, it's failing, but it hasn't failed to the point of tripping the 60 amp breaker.
Yeah.
And then me being an addition to that wasn't enough to trip the breaker. So we're just locked in, melting, and going for the ride.
You're acting as a resistor, so it's not shorting effectively to trip it.
Right.
Yeah. There should be a ground fault, to prevent that kind of thing. But I don't know, maybe
the equipment is old, was old, and so it didn't have that newer technology in it.
Were you working? Was this your own, or do you have like a repair job? Is that why you were there?
So I was a heating and air conditioning technician.
Okay.
So yeah, I ended up working at this facility to there was many things I was doing at the facility, one of which was working on this furnace.
Yeah. And this was how many years ago?
It was January of 2018. So it's been a few years now.
Yeah. January is the time to work on furnaces.
Yeah, it happens, right?
Yeah, unless you live in Florida, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're being electrocuted, and it's not just like, oh, I could die at any time, I need to rethink my life, which is kind of what happened to me. You have something that's more like, I don't know, you've heard of DMT, maybe psilocybin.
Right. Okay.
You're familiar with those experiences?
I'm familiar with the explanation of those experiences.
Right.
That a lot of times in near death, we naturally have, say, a DMT type experience that is released out of the brain. And so then I'm like, well, I most likely went through something that was DMT related.
Yeah, because the brain naturally releases that when you die, apparently. And
right.
That's fairly well documented. And so you could argue that people who do DMT are artificially inducing a near-death experience. That would be probably most people would agree that that's relatively true on some level, at least.
Have you done it?
No, I haven't. If I want to go off into other realms, it's disturbingly easy for me to do that. I have to be careful not to do that. Honestly, I don't need drugs. I don't need psilocybin or anything like that. I don't know that it's even me that's causing it to happen. It's more like if I go and I sit in a closet and pray and I meditate on something like the kindness of God, the goodness of God, or I picture a person who I care about, it's like I start to lose touch with the physical world around me, and I start to move into this other kind of realm where it's like God is there and he can communicate sometimes by just an impression of what he's feeling, and sometimes other things come into that. I call it a vision space. Sometimes I'll have visions, and the longer I stay in that, the weirder it gets, the deeper it gets, and then it starts to like have consequences in the real world. And I'll like picture somebody and what's going on with them, and I'll think about the will of God and the goodness of God, or something like what would God want to have happen here, and then I'll pray, or I'll picture things changing accordingly, and then I'll find out that thing actually happens to that person. So I've maybe even taken it to a weirder level where I'm going into what would be kind of like a DMT experience, but I'm actually having some kind of impact that affects the real world. And I think maybe that's what intercessory prayer is supposed to be. But, the way that I'm describing it right now would probably offend a lot of, more conservative style Christians who believe that prayer isn't really supposed to be effective, or it's not supposed to work like that, maybe. I'd be accused of visualization techniques or something new agey or whatever. And I guess I don't know where I stand on all that stuff, but I know that if I spend a lot of time in prayer, that I get results. So I'm not inclined to stop doing that kind of weird thing necessarily, because I see where there's genuine fruit that comes out of it. People whose lives are changed for the better. Conflicts are resolved. They have more peace. They turn to God in a deeper way, etc. So, if I just have to judge it by its fruit, I would say it seems good. So I still, it's like cautiously, I will do this with extreme caution. And I am so committed to being biblical, like staying grounded in what does the Bible actually say about God. And I kind of inherited my view of Scripture from more conservative mainstream religion. The Bible is the Word of God flat out. Nothing that happens to you should ever contradict Scripture. I still operate with that as a kind of a presuppositional framework, even though the arguments for that are full of fallacies and whatever. Given that, I'm passionate enough that I try to read through the whole Bible once every 2 to 3 months. And I learned to read the Greek and the Hebrew, and I track, like, what does this word actually mean back in its proper context. And, all that to say, I take the Bible extremely seriously. I'm very disciplined as a student of the Bible. And I'm also going into these weird places with the supernatural, but with a tremendous amount of caution. But this is really more about you, so.
All right.
Okay, so the nitty gritty, you're being shocked. At some point, you're in this process of being seriously injured. Your body is being probably fried. And was it like immediately you went out of body? Was it after 30 seconds you went out of body? Like, play by play. What's going on here?
All right. So yeah, I'm very much conscious and in this reality. While I'm being shocked for 30 seconds, I'm doing everything I can to escape and release my grip or pull and shake, do it, whatever I can to get out of this furnace and this situation. And then I have a series of thoughts of I am not gonna survive this, and so I've done everything I can, and and nothing has worked. So basically, I know what happens next. That the electricity and bodies don't get along, and this is going to kill me. So I go through that process, and I end up kind of accepting it to the point of I'm going to die here, and then somebody that loves me, somebody that knows me, is going to come looking, and eventually they're going to find me, and then the imagination was able to kind of project a potential reality of like what that person might find, like my dead, burned, body on the floor in this basement. So I kind of had this awareness of what that might look like, and kind of went through that experience in third person of like what my death might look like to somebody else, and that emotion came over me of like empathizing with what that would feel like. And so I go through that process while I'm alive, very much conscious of it, and I end up giving up. I'm like, all right, I've gone through that. This is where I'm going to die, and I'm done. And so when I gave in, then I kind of went through this a little bit longer of actually dying, But I stopped trying. I stopped wriggling. I stopped, trying to pull out of this thing. And when I finally died, my awareness left my body, and so then that became kind of an instantaneous change or shift. That I was in this basement being electrocuted 1 second. The next thing that I'm aware of, I happen to be standing on a cliff edge overlooking an ocean. And my toes I'm like right on the edge, and my toes are hanging off the edge of this cliff. And it's a vertical, several hundred feet drop. And then instantly, my attention is brought to my right, and I have a aspect of self, and that I'm calling up. It's a perspective that I normally would have access to, and it was very much my emotions. So,
Yeah, before you continue,
okay.
you said your toes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you have toes. You're out of body, but you have a sense that there are toes. Are you wearing shoes or barefoot?
I don't recall that actually.
You
And
don't,
so it was like my
because I'm
yeah,
thinking, when you're conscious, like you can divert your attention to different things. Like right now, you're probably not thinking about your feet or your
right,
fingertips. But if you think about it, it's like my fingertips are currently transmitting data.
right,
And your fingertips in the real world are just ground off by a fan, and you're feeling the electricity shocking your hand, and you're definitely aware of your body and it's transmitting data. And then you go into this other mode.
right.
Does it feel like a physical reality? Is it
Mhm.
more vague, dreamlike, or?
Yeah, it would be more dreamlike, and very much uh, um, uh, like it felt like a ghost, and so kind of ethereal in that way. That like I'm like things exist, but I don't have connection to them, and so it's kind of like ghost-like, um, and so like and then in that space, I was also aware that there's lots of other I don't know, we call them apparitions, but I call them souls that
Mhm.
were, that essence existed. And there was just a huge horde of them, and I just was one of the many that was being pushed off this cliff.
So when you have dreams, some dreams are super lucid. I've had lucid dreams before where it's like this is more real than when I'm awake, you know.
Right,
And then most dreams though are kind of fuzzy. It's like you're in and out. It's like you're trying to keep your eyes open, but you can't quite see what's going on. You wake up and you remember bits and pieces. And how lucid was this experience? Was it like being like super awake, or was it more kind of vague and uncertain, and you know what I mean?
right. Yeah, it was very much super awake. It was like I'm in reality, and my awareness is very much aware of that. Now I'm in this new reality, and I'm very much aware of this new reality. And it's just being experienced in a much different way, but I'm very much aware of this new space.
Yeah. And so it's probably like time has slowed down, or time is passing in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, time is not passing in the same way. So it's like relative time. So you could be in that space for 100 years, right? And in reality, or in the physical world, only a second passed during that 100 years or something, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, you hear a lot of that kind of thing, of relative time or time displacement or something. That seems to be true of all these experiences. So
Right.
it's like slow motion or something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree that I was in that space for seemingly, at least a half an hour, or maybe longer. But or that's the way that I would try and equate it to time. But I know that it's not possible that I was sitting there being electrocuted in this reality. For that long. And so it's like, how many seconds was it that I was dead, technically connected to this furnace still being electrocuted while I was having this other experience? I don't actually know. But it seemed like it was a while that I was experiencing this transition and this near-death experience.
So there's other things around you, and I know in dreams it's like it's hard to explain. Sometimes in a dream, you can be experiencing something first person, simultaneously looking at yourself third person, and aware that there's somebody standing over here who you can't see, but you're just as aware of them as if you were looking straight at them. And it's like the rules of normal space time and interaction and those kinds of things, they just don't apply in dreams. There's like ways of knowing that are just out there that, and when you say you're aware of other beings, I think of that, is it like that? It's like, there's something over here. But maybe you're not sure how you know.
To some degree, that I was able to say like look left, look right kind of thing, and that's when I became more aware of the surroundings. And so kind of like I said, that there was my emotions that were yelling at me from my right, outside of my essence, outside of my body, or my ghost,
spiritual body,
whatever.
spiritual body.
Yeah, right. My spiritual body, like there's this perspective that's belongs to me, but it's no longer who I am. It's outside of me. And when I look off to my right to see what's yelling at me, then I'm like, oh, I recognize this. But then also there's this cliff edge that is like escaping. Like instead of being straight off into the distance, it's kind of drawing back a little bit, and so it goes out for a long ways, but then it rounds off and kind of escapes back behind me. And when I'm looking at that, then there's a whole bunch of other spirit bodies that ghost-like apparitions that are being pushed off this cliff edge, and they're packed in like sardines. And so then I'm able to literally witness that. But then I become very much aware that back there's say spirit bodies, or there's this essence that is unaware that the cliff actually exists. And so they're like marching through time, so to speak, moving towards this, whereas then there's a whole line or a whole group that is aware that this cliff edge exists, the precipice of death, and they don't want to die. And so then they resist that. And so then they're like pushing back, and then there's this like a horde that's pushing them off, and that resistance is packing them in like super tight. And so I'm able to witness that compression down the line. And so then I'm able to like see my emotions outside of my body screaming at me, see this compression of other ghost-like souls being pushed off this cliff. And then that's really intense. And then I look away and I turn off to my left, and the same cliff edge is escaping off to my left, and the same horde packed in like sardines is off to my left. And I happen to have what I'm calling my ego, trying to explain how to escape, or here's some methodologies, and here's like a different viewpoint to survive. And so that's being presented to me outside of my body.
You say you see your emotions on your right, and your ego on the left, which I can't help but associate, left brain, right brain. Emotions on the right.
Right.
Maybe there's something that I don't know.
Right.
What does it look like?
And so it looks like I'm looking in a mirror, actually. And so it's kind of like I recognize that. It's like looking in a mirror. Like there's another version of me that I would recognize that as if looking in a mirror, say today. And that was outside of me, like looking in a mirror. But then it was that representation, that mirror representation, had its own embodiment.
Yeah.
So it like only had emotion on one side, and it only had ego on the other side. And so like looking in a mirror, it'd be kind of an encapsulation of all that you are, whereas it was like separated and pushed out, and kind of like categorized almost.
So there's you, and you're in the middle. You're taking this all in. Probably, I'm gonna guess that it's the analytical you, right? The one that's like evaluating everything that's going on. And there's the emotional you, and there's this other you. And I get the emotional you. It's going to be like telling you to be afraid, or telling you that there's still hope, or it's something that connects in an emotional way. I guess I could just let you finish. Is it like there's an argument coming from the right side and an argument coming from the left side?
Yep. And the left side would be kind of that analytical self.
Okay.
So that was outside of me, right?
Okay.
And then the emotions are outside of me. And then I also became aware. I heard a voice from behind me that I recognized as like my own, and that voice said, "Don't do it. What will we do without you?" And in that, I became aware that I call it my roommate. And so I have opinions and judgments that are separate from my emotions and that are separate from my analytical self. That those opinions and judgments I call my roommate, and that's like the thing that gnaws away at the back of my mind. And it's another part of self, and that was behind me. And so in that I had these perspectives outside of me, and I became very much aware that I'm like the watcher. I'm the soul. I'm the part that accepts and embraces all of this and all of the realities and so and all of the perspectives. And so I was very much in the center of these other perspectives that I used and became and like operated within as a being in reality. And I was separate from those.
Yeah. So I get the emotional self. I get the, I assumed you were the analytical, and you're saying no, the thing on the left was the analytical.
Right.
And that might just be because I tend to function as analytical most of the time. I'm not very emotional. And then there's that other part of you from behind that's also making an argument, which
Right.
you're implying is neither emotional nor analytical. It's something else.
Mm-hmm.
And then you as the watcher, however you describe that, I think that's like maybe really, really interesting, important, in terms of understanding what free will is. What are we doing and when we make a decision? And you've got the committee,
Right.
in AA they talk about the committee, and it's like, which of the voices in my head do I want to listen to today?
Right.
And I would argue that some people might have 100 people in there screaming different opinions from different perspectives, and the fact that maybe you only have 3, that's probably why you have such a sound mind.
Perhaps, but and I think that each one, splits off. The emotion becomes all these different emotions, but they all kind of filter into one point.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm able to, categorize them into these focus points.
Yeah. So what would you say is the person behind you?
And so that I call it my roommate, and it's kind of like if you have say in real world you have a roommate that like doesn't wash the dishes but wants a clean house.
Yeah.
Like doesn't it has its opinions,
Mm-hmm.
but doesn't really carry the weight.
Mm-hmm.
And so then if you don't do it, then that roommate will cast judgment upon you. Like there's something wrong with you that you need to step it up or whatever, but it's not about them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the roommate analogy is just there's a label to try and say that there are opinions and judgments
Mm-hmm.
that I have that aren't analytical and they're not emotional.
Mm-hmm.
And so those opinions and judgments can feed the analytical side or feed the emotional side, and you can come up with a new result. Yeah. But the opinions and judgments come from somewhere else.
Maybe like stored memories of things that people have said or something.
Yeah, and that's the part of my psyche does definitely have access to the imagination and to the history that I have lived.
So, if you want to jump in here at any point with a question or something, you can. We didn't even introduce you. It's like, who's this guy in the background? I don't really know. And at the end of it, it would have been cool to be like, what? There was a third person. Oh my God.
Right?
We didn't see that guy.
Yeah.
He must have been the roommate.
I am the roommate.
He is
Yeah?
the roommate.
Oh, okay.
Literally.
I was gonna say, man, what are you
Yeah.
really fond of your roommates, huh?
Yeah.
That asshole who doesn't carry his weight, but
Yeah.
really is judgmental. I was like, man, I'm glad to be your roommate.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, we blew it now because now we've acknowledged that he exists.
Yeah.
Right.
Darn it.
Yeah. Yeah. But no, literally, we are roommates. And so that's something that it does play the reality that I exist under. I do have literal roommates, but I also have an internal roommate.
Yeah. I've had to go through this process of waking up one day and realizing there are aspects of my life where I've basically just been gaslighted. I've been told that the person who is bigger and older and in charge is wiser, and consequently, when I disagree, it's because I'm not as smart. And so I'm sold a reality that comes with sort of force to it, and then to realize, oh, a whole lot of the things that I assume are because the bigger, smarter person told me this was true, and now I'm realizing the bigger, smarter person was wrong about a lot of things. And as a result of that, now I have to completely reevaluate everything that I assume to be true. And maybe that's kind of what we're doing when we talk about near-death experiences. We're constantly being fed a version of reality, which is kind of creepy, that who's talking to us, who is explaining to us the laws of physics and making it consistent. And does it just exist, or is someone projecting this world to us?
Right.
And if so, what are the assumptions that we have about it that may not be real? And is it that when we have a near-death experience, we're sort of forced out of this illusion that's around us? And does that cause us to question the fundamental nature of reality? And it's like, yes, obviously it does. How deep does this rabbit hole go? It's one of those really disturbing questions.
Yeah.
And I suspect, you look at Jesus, who he's walking on water. And to him, it's like, he wasn't thinking, I'm walking on water, this is amazing. He was thinking, I need to go over there.
Right.
So he just, whatever, walk across the water. When he talks about going to the cross, and he's like, don't you realize that if I wanted to, I could just ask for, what did he say, 10,000 legions of angels to come and rescue me? So he's like aware of this, maybe it's a lower level of reality where he can do things like walk on water, or after the resurrection, he's like, he appears and then he's gone. He's somewhere else. He doesn't need to use doors anymore because, it's just a formality. You could open the door if you wanted to, but why not just walk right through it? And it just, it makes me wonder, how much are we missing out on? How much is really possible? Because the whole world has been gaslighted. And if you ever go like radically against the whole group, you get so much pressure. Like say you were part of a cult, and you start to say, I think maybe the cult leader is completely nuts and we should stop following him. Then it's like, oh, you think the whole group is wrong, and everybody freaks out and all this stuff. And so then there's all this pressure, and so we stop thinking, we stop going lower and going deeper. And I just wonder, like, how deep does the rabbit hole go? And how deep should we keep going? And if we did, would it be, is that an explanation for Jesus saying, have a paradigm shift, right? When he says repent, the word repent is metanoia in Greek, and it's after thought, which is kind of like, think about what you're assuming. So he comes and he's like, hey, look, I'm walking on water. Think about what you're assuming. He raises somebody from the dead. Lazarus, get up, And then he's like, think about what you're assuming. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Think about what you're assuming. And over again. It's like every time you see the word gospel, with just a couple of exceptions, it's go out and preach the gospel and tell them the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Therefore, repent, think about what you're assuming, right?
Mm.
So he manifests this higher reality, Mount of Transfiguration, where like suddenly these two beings appear with that are like shimmering white, whiter than anything that is white, and they're glowing, and Jesus goes up and he transforms and he's glowing with them, and it's like it's just another one of these hundreds of examples of there is a higher reality, and the people who are investing in this world are living a lie and they're deluded, and they need to wake up to this higher reality, and to take part of it, here's this path that is the path of the cross. And yeah, it's like mind-blowing. I guess it's like why I'm interested in these kinds of conversations, because this is real. And sitting around the campfire singing Kumbaya with a Baptist preacher holding up the Bible, what is that? I don't even know what that is. It's like somebody who's just trying to capitalize on some stuff they don't understand. You know what I mean?
I believe I do.
I think we're still good.
Think you're still good?
Yeah, we're still good.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. So, have you completely what other details? Is there anything else in your story that you haven't filled in? Colors, smells.
No, not really. Colors or smells. So like those senses aren't available to me. And then so I become aware of this environment. Kind of like how I described it as kind of this ghost-like apparition. This soul. And I have access to these perspectives that are mine, but they're more of a reflection. And then I like after hearing like "Don't do it, what will we do without you?" that something in my head was, or something in my perspective was able to portray that to me. And then me as say the watcher decided to jump off this cliff. And so I ended up diving off this cliff without being held. So like the emotion is like, don't die, and it's the ego is like, this is how you stay, and and then I'm just like, I'm good. And so I choose and I jump off this cliff and I dive into this ocean that's below me. And it's several hundred feet, it seems. I land in the ocean, and it's like an endless ocean that when I'm in it, actually I recognize is like a sea of souls. And so it's actually not made of water. And so then I start to amalgamate and become part of this whole. And so then there's very little definition at that point. So we're like on this, they're being squashed. All the souls are like kind of being squashed into this on this precipice of death. But then when they're in the ocean, then they're like really squashed to the point where it's hard to tell that there's differences. And so then I'm like in that fresh, and then starting to blend. And so then I'm like trying to move or swim through this reality, or this sea, and not getting anywhere. And then I hear a voice that I don't recognize, and it says, "You don't belong here." And so I ended up like getting plucked from the sea and brought to what was just like the white void. And so it wasn't necessarily overwhelmingly bright, but it was very stark white, lack of anything. In that space, I became very much aware that my perspectives that I had access to up on the cliff edge are no longer available. And so I tried to ask or interpret, and those perspectives were gone. And so then I'm left with just kind of like soul at that point, like with the essence of me, of whatever that might mean. And so then I'm sitting there, I'm like, well, who am I? And so that was my question. And then I became very much aware that there was an entity that was sitting that was in presence in front of me, and that entity I recognized as God and say death, or like a positive negative, like a yin yang type energy that there was a dualistic entity before me.
Is it one entity or two entities?
It would be I recognize it as one entity that had two like presentations, and so it was like they belonged together as one, kind of like a yin yang, like they're
Okay.
two things that are one, and so but they were like whole on their own, but not separate from one another. And so that was what I was faced with, and I'm asking, who am I?
Mhm.
And in that, I became aware, kind of like having a vision or say a download. The explanation that I received was that I, as soul, was a mirror image of this entity, and so that basically I am that is me, and so that entity was my higher self, and then that God self created a soul, and so then like that manifested a soul, and then my question was, who am I? And so then I became aware that I am a cosmic essence,
Okay.
that has manifested a soul, and then that soul has been given a body, and that body has been shackled to time and space. And so that's the awareness, the encapsulation of like, who am I? And so it's like all of that. And then that body also has access to those perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, as soon as you talk about duality, then the Christian listeners are going to freak out. Oh my gosh, this is New Age cultism, whatever. I'm convinced that sometimes we're struggling for the right words to explain things that are maybe higher than what we understand, and we may pick a word that's associated with something maybe occultic or new agey or demonic or unbiblical or something like that. So I would encourage the audience to listen beyond the words to try to get at the meaning and not immediately judge.
Right?
Yeah.
That's appreciated.
Yeah, and there may be something in this duality that you're seeing. You see maybe the life and death, light and dark, good and evil. I don't know. It could be that the knowledge of good and evil, which is something that only gods possess, or God-like beings possess, is what you're seeing. And certainly God is aware of pain, and he's aware of pleasure. And, as a point of clarity, just what the Bible is talking about here, good and evil are not just straightforward good and evil in the Bible. You have like a dozen different Hebrew words to express different concepts. So like in the Garden of Eden, good and evil are ra or ra'a and tov, and it's basically destruction or joy, pain, pleasure, disgusting, delightful. It's the thing that we gravitate towards is what tov is, and then the thing that we turn from is what ra'a is. It's pain or destruction or displeasure or disgust or just things that I don't like versus things that I do like. And and that's a completely different concept from something like the word tzedek in Hebrew, which is to have a correct understanding, and it's translated to either righteous or just or justice. So like people confuse evil and unjust, and it's kind of no wonder, because actually the opposite of tzedek, which is righteous, like honesty, truth, consistency, faithfulness. Like if you say you're going to do something and you don't, that would be the opposite of tzedek. And the opposite of tzedek is hevel, which is, so it's misleading in biblical terms. And I have yet to hear any Christian leaders sort of point out that there's all these different words that we just think of as good and evil, but it's more complex than that, biblically speaking. So I don't know, just to throw that out there. I suspect maybe what you saw was something like the knowledge of good and evil that divine beings possess, and that when man was first created had never experienced, suffering or pain or discomfort. He's just chilling in the garden, hanging out, naked, eating fruit. And then all of a sudden there's conflict. We have just taken a step out of fellowship with the God who is in charge. And now we're not sure if he is good because the snake is saying, well, God is trying to keep something good from you. Anyway, just to, kind of throw a maybe more biblical spin on the yin yang duality, maybe you're seeing the knowledge of good and evil.
That I believe that the knowledge of good and evil was very much represented. Um, uh, it was encapsulated in a in an awareness, and so it was kind of like I said, there's like the good and evil, or the positive and negative, but then those two separate things were encapsulated in one thing, and so then that one being it was like having like a god that was, but then there was that other side that I think is not really represented, like the negative or the evil side is not represented well in, say, traditional religions, as being part of God. Like God is usually pure and clean, and the negative side is usually, like, say, Satan. It's a separate outcast from God. Whereas my understanding, or the way that I was presented with God, was that they're not separate. They're very much intertwined with one another. And so both parts are represented as one in this godlike being.
So if you were to describe the light and the dark side as a motive or like a desire, and when I say motive, it's like when I'm hungry, I want to go and eat. When I'm thirsty, I want to go and drink. If I'm the light thing, I want, what does it want? What is the light side trying to make happen?
It's very much the feeling of love, the feeling of compassion, to care.
Okay.
And so that was the notion that I got.
Okay, so what about the dark side? What is it? Like, if it's just completely unrestrained and it gets to create the universe in its image how it wants, what's it gonna make?
And so I equated it to death, to the ending, destruction.
And still, like the opposite of love, like it wants harm, like malice maybe, or
no, didn't feel like it had that kind of agenda. No. And so it was more it was kind of along the lines of like, because there is a light and love that almost like there's a description that, like, without pain and suffering, then why would you appreciate bliss and euphoria? So, like, if you had the Garden of Eden, and this amazing space, then without pain and suffering, you wouldn't appreciate that.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of like, well, because there's one, there needs to be the other, in order for that understanding and appreciation to exist.
I think it's one of those concepts that can be misconstrued and can lead to some weird places if people think about it the wrong way. If there's no light and dark, if there's no good and evil, if there's, like, say there's only good, if you had the choice, would you have lobster thermidor and a Chianti, or would you have a T-bone steak and a beer? And maybe you slightly prefer one over the other, and both are good. Well, at this point, then the relative good and evil here are kind of over here on the good spectrum, but you're going to choose one over the other. And so, maybe our relative spectrum of good and evil is confined to some limited space. But wherever we're at on that spectrum, let's say we live in a world where the worst kind of evil is if you had to eat steak instead of lobster. And that's the most catastrophic suffering that ever existed in our limited little world. And so it's the kid who had to have the pineapple flavored sucker when he really wanted the cherry sucker. And what happens? He completely melts down. It's the worst tragedy you could possibly imagine. He's in tears. He's screaming in agony because he had to have the cherry sucker or the pineapple one instead of the cherry one, whatever. And it's like what you're left with is there's no way you can possibly imagine a world with living beings who can make decisions that matter, where one decision, can't be better than another decision. And consequently, if we're going to be aware and our decisions are going to matter, there has to be the potential for one decision to be preferable over another. And if you keep expanding that, then you're going to get to the place where, well, there's a possibility of genocide is a possibility that you might be able to choose. And then there's a possibility of, praying for the people who are murdering you as you're hanging on the cross, which is like an absolute expression of kindness versus an absolute expression of evil. And, narrowing that band down to steak versus lobster, well, it's still the same question. Which is better? Which reality do we want to create? A world that is just unimaginably evil where we have to eat steak. We can't have lobster every day, And it's just like this little spectrum that, goes all the way over into mass genocide, But I would contest that evil and good both have to, exist potentially, at least, in order for anything that we do to matter in any way. And so it's like I can kind of see some version of a dual God, if you will, which is, a heretical way of expressing that in terms of Christianity or, whatever. But it's like there has to be some version of that it's just logically impossible for it to be anything other than that. Otherwise, nothing we do ever matters. Everything just results in perfect pleasure.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. And it was where so that awareness is kind of like outside of time and space, but the soul is the experiencer, and so the mirror image, the soul is capable of experiencing time and space, and so then the whole purpose is to have an experience within that dualistic projection.
So, yeah, I mean, I think I would agree that if we're not sentient, if we can't experience pain versus pleasure, or even just, relative pleasure, the relative pleasure of the lobster versus the steak, then nothing really matters. And so to say that, the meaning of life is to have experiences, it's hard to argue with that. If it's not that, then what is it? And you can throw some theological answer out there. Well, it's to bring glory to God. What does that mean? Does that mean that we exist so that God can experience things, and it's all about Him? And okay, well then, what about our experiences? Do they matter? And some would say no, they don't. And, God's opinion is the only one that matters, or His experiences are the only ones that matter. And then it's like, okay, well then what you're saying basically is that God could care less what happens to us, and He has no love. And it's like, it just creates all kinds of problems.
Right. Yeah. And that is, say, under the assumption that we're separate from God, so that there's this dualistic experience that is my higher self, that I am a representative of that. I'm a mirror image of that, and that I am now capable of experiencing an experience that is feeding directly into that higher self, that God entity. That so it is through me, through my soul, experiencing something, and then I happen to have some free will as to what those experiences might be. But as far as as God is concerned, it's just like, please experience something. Just have whatever experience, good, bad, or indifferent, just for the sake of the experience, because all of that is coming in and like being embraced.
It's pretty like mind blowing to think about it in that way. To clarify, when you say you refer to God and you're also calling it higher self, what I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm hearing is, I am a self, I am aware, I'm experiencing, and God is a self, and it is aware, experiencing. There's a connection between the two, but you're not in any way saying that's me over there.
There's
Or is it just fuzzy?
it's not both. Yeah, it's kind of both. So like, I am not able to live as God.
Okay.
Right? So I'm not able to like go on the other side of the mirror.
Oh.
Right? And so like, I'm not really becoming that. In like this body, like it's not possible. But I definitely am familiar that I am not separate from, and I am identical to that entity. And so that is me in a different form. And then I do have a meditation practice where I've been able to say expand and become more than what this brain or body is capable of experiencing. And it is kind of like going into the Godhead, or having kind of crossing that bridge and experiencing from the perspective of that higher self. It's difficult to do, and I'm able to experience and witness from there, but I'm not able to like make change or do anything. So it's a much different. It's not really an experience. It's more of the ability to witness, and so it's kind of like I've been able to expand into that space and kind of like see the fabric of time and space, like what that looks like, but I'm not able to experience it.
So you're like a distant observer. You're observing it, but you're not like interacting with it.
Yeah.
I think of the connection between God and self as kind of like if you were to go up to the ocean and you scoop a cup of water out of it. You don't have the entire ocean in the cup, but the cup is full of 100% ocean.
Yeah. Well, and again, there are people who are conservative Christian mindset who are going to freak out, at just having this discussion. Hence theological dark web, right?
Right.
But I take Genesis. It's like God formed this thing out of the clay, and then he breathed his spirit into it and it became alive. So the cup of water out of the ocean, maybe it's an imperfect metaphor, but it's like it's at least partially true. It's partially a good metaphor, because if we say that God existed from eternity past, he's uncaused, uncreated, existing for all of time and space and whatever. And whatever that is, whatever God is, whatever he's made of, he takes some of that and puts it into man, and man becomes alive. Well, then you now have something in man that was not created, that has existed from eternity past.
Right.
Which, it's like we have something eternal in us. We have something uncaused in us. So we have something uncreated in us. And then as Jesus, is revealing what it takes to get back to God, and some of the apostles, and there's all this language like in First John where it says, how does it word it? It says, when he is revealed, we will be like him. We will see him as he is. So God is a particular way. We're not encountering him as he is, but when he's revealed, we become like him. That's what the Bible says. And the devil said, you'll be like God. And everybody says, that's a lie. You'll never be like God. It's like, well, the devil wasn't necessarily lying when he said you will be like God. He was lying by implication about some other things. But he wasn't necessarily lying about that. Or, or when John says we will be like him. Or when, I think it's Paul says, we're given the power to become the children of God through the revelation of Jesus. Or like where it says in 1 Peter, we become partakers of the divine nature through the promises that were revealed in Christ. There's all kinds of talk in the Bible about returning to a divine state, becoming like God. And I think Christians are afraid of some of that language, and they maybe just, kind of go around those verses, and we're not meant to understand, and that's a mystery, and because that's a lot easier than saying something that you might get kicked out of church for. But again, it's one of those things where Christians jump to conclusions, they form tribes, they stick to the things that they like, and they miss some of these deeper realities. Like if you take the word God, it's a word that has all kinds of connotations for us. Well, the word that it comes from, you go back to the word Elohim in the Hebrew. It's not a word that refers to God. It's a word that refers to a class of being. It's kind of like bird. Bird is a class. If you say there's only one bird, well, nobody say there's only one bird. But a woodpecker is a type of bird, and it is fully bird. And a pelican is a type of bird, and it's fully bird. When Saul seeks the witch of Endor because she wants to contact Samuel, or because he wants to contact Samuel, she says, I see Elohim coming up from the grave. And it's the same word, Elohim, that's translated into God. And here comes Samuel back from the dead, and he's an Elohim now. And you see God sits in the council of gods. El is in the council of Elohim. So it's like the Bible definitely teaches that there are multiple Elohim gods, right? But then there's one who is most high, one who is the creator, one who is the King of kings and Lord of lords, God of gods, from whom all others flow. So it's not that there is one God, it's that there's one Jehovah. And there's multiple beings who are of the same class type as Jehovah, but he's the top of them. So even in the Shema, the famous verse, Deuteronomy 6:4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. It's not teaching there is only one God. It's teaching that Jehovah is Echad, which is the cardinal number one, but also means first, primary, the big kahuna, the top, In James, where he says, you believe that God is one? Well, great. The demons also believe and they tremble. Well, the demons aren't trembling because monotheism, Jehovah's, not six guys. They're trembling because Jehovah is number one. He's the first, the primary, the top. So, we have this very limited understanding of what God even means, what the word God refers to. And it essentially, biblically, it just means a spirit being, of which types of beings Jehovah is the absolute top of the heap. Yeah. But because of all these things we assume about that word, and because we don't bother to read the Hebrew, and we don't look at the context, and we just listen to what the Bible college professor said when he was teaching a pastor who then passes it on to us,
Right.
We're confused about a lot of things that would be simple if we had the courage to just assume the college professor might be an idiot. maybe the pastor's wrong. Maybe he doesn't know, you know. Let's go and read the Bible for ourselves and look up these words and see how they're using them and see what this word means. And then it's like our understanding opens up. And then you have someone like me who's not terrified of having this conversation. I've already been kicked out of every church I've tried to attend, so it's not like I have a lot to lose. You know.
Right. Yeah. I have something that's coming to mind that I think is relevant, worth sharing, and that referring back to soul is here to experience, and so there's an aspect of realization where you become aware of something, and it can become knowledge, and then you have the experience of that knowledge, and so it's the experience is what we're all about, but if you have that experience over time and with repetition, then it can become, say, a truth in your own life, and you start to embody it as wisdom. And so there's two lines in the Bible that I would like to bring attention to.
Okay.
That God is love, and so we're saying like there is no, it's like the word God is synonymous with the word love, and that I was able to witness that and experience that in my near-death experience, that there is a God that is totally about love, as best as the word love can describe,
Caring.
something, right? So there's that, and then there's there's a line. It's in the New Testament. I can't remember where exactly. I think it's for Corinthians, I think. Anyway, it says that Jesus is wisdom, the word itself.
Yeah.
And so for me, my experience is that, okay, if Jesus is wisdom and God is love, since then we can take away the religious connotation and the muckiness of definition and say we have wisdom and love, and that if you are here for experiences to actually have and gain wisdom, then with wisdom you're able to access love. And so without Jesus you can't get to God, supposedly. So without wisdom, then how do you experience love? And so I'm very much along the lines of the soul is here for experiences. Those experiences translate into wisdom, and with the embrace of wisdom, you're able to experience love. And so then, as a being, I'm able to experience what it's like to be like Jesus and to be connected to God.
With well, love guided by wisdom is where a lot of thinkers land. Sam Harris, who is an atheist, or at least claims to be, he lands on that. He says, the greatest ethic is love guided by wisdom. And it's pretty easy to see why you need wisdom. If you said, "Oh, I love my kids, that's why I give them all the candy they want," No, you gotta and wisdom is like the ability to see. I like how Jordan Peterson puts it. He says it's sending your mind into the multiverse, which is a fancy way of saying, think about all these different things that might happen depending on what you do here. What happens if you eat nothing but candy every day for a year? And we can imagine that, and we can go, oh, I think it's not a good idea. I don't want to go there. And if you really love your kids, you're going to have to say no to them because you have more wisdom than they do. But yeah, I mean, that's a pretty, I think it's a pretty straightforward concept. Most people agree. You have to have love and wisdom.
Right. Yeah. And it comes with the positive and the negative. Without that balance, then you're not really going to be talking about wisdom.
Yeah. Part of bearing the image of God or being in the image of God, you said like a reflection, which is interesting. I believe that God is able to see the multiverse, so to speak. In other words, what would happen if I did this? What would happen if I did this? And, there's all these different possibilities.
Right.
And if God is able to view these different possibilities and we are of the same essence as him, then maybe that's what reason is. It's the ability to see all the possibilities and to see which one, as far as we can look into the future, this is the one that I want. And I would say that very few people use their God-given ability to project their mind into the multiverse, or you might call it think. And consequently, so there are some people who don't have free will, or they don't use it.
Right.
The Bible talks about people who are like unreasoning animals, creatures of instinct. And maybe those are the people who the emotions are screaming and the analytical is screaming and the roommate is screaming and whatever, and they're all screaming and they're just like, they just go with it. And they don't stop and isolate themselves and listen. What are the different voices that are coming at me? What universes are they going to create if I take this guy or this guy or this guy? Are any of these better than any of the other ones? And so that exercise of thinking, that might be the most divine thing that we can do, is to put forth the effort to imagine what's going to happen and then pick the best universe. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
I do. And so I end up, I have a vision of the future. And so it's to some degree, I believe that I can't see the future.
Yeah. What would happen if I dropped this phone?
Right? Yeah. But when I look out into the future, it seems like I'm looking down a wormhole almost. And so that there's all these possible realities that are happening. And so what I have done is thinking and focusing. And so there is a future that I believe to be real and like probable, that today doesn't seem probable. And so I it's like taking a 360-degree view, look up and down and all these different possibilities, all the different timelines, looking at all in, every direction and being like, that one, I'm going to do that one. And so then every choice that I make, say free will, is going to be navigating in order to accomplish that future and that goal. And so when I go through life, I'm using a check and balance and saying, is this method, is this choice in alignment with where I'm going? Is it some egotistical something that I'm doing that's going to pull me off in this direction, or is it in alignment with what I'm trying to achieve? Or is this emotion pulling me off into some spiral that is not in alignment with what I'm trying to achieve? And so always being aware of what is happening, what is unfolding, what my choices are, and then confirming or denying whether or not it's on, can I see it unfolding in a way that's on the path that I'm moving down, that I've chosen to go for. And so I'm looking for a future that is sustainable, that life is able to proliferate, that is much more intrinsic than humans, all life that happens to exist on this planet. And so it's like, how do we take care of all of all that exists on Earth? How do we take care of Earth? As far as we have been able to find, is life doesn't really exist other than on Earth. So like, how do we take care of this? And so my endeavor and the vision that I see, I look down the wormhole, and what I see on the other side is like a continent-sized structure that we've created that is made up of these like mile-wide spheres that in each one of them is like a sample of Earth and all the biodiversity that happens to be contained. And so like one would be, say, a desert section, and another would be Pacific Northwest, and another would be the ocean. And so you'd have all these different biodiversity ranges represented on this platform. and that platform is capable of being independent of Earth. So now all of a sudden there's an option. There's a copy of on a smaller scale. Even though it's continent size, it's still not Earth.
Mhm.
And so, but then having it to where that whole envelope is sustainable. That we care enough about life in order to have it not destroyed. And
Mhm.
so, what do we have to do to understand, to say no, and then experience and become wise for life? And so that's for the rest of my life. That's where I'm shooting,
Yeah.
as on that pathway, and everything that I do is along those lines.
Is that, the Christian ethic, you could argue the biblical ethic, is that this world is passing away and attempts to preserve it, transhumanism or environmentalism, um, they're they're vain. Um, the idea of preserving life, doing good, loving people with wisdom, like yes, absolutely, that should be the governing ethic, and that's going to lead to you not abusing animals and not dumping oil in the streams and etc. because you want to be a good steward of everything. But ultimately, Jesus is saying, "My kingdom is not this world. My kingdom is in the realm of the Elohim. It's a divine kingdom, a heavenly kingdom, and that kingdom is so much higher than this world. And let me show you: walk on water, raise the dead, etc." Um, it talks about him creating a new heavens and earth where righteousness dwells, that sort of thing. And then you see the people who follow the Christ ethic, who walk in the steps of Christ. They do not love their lives unto death. They do not fight for this world because this world is not their home. They end up also going to the cross. A lot of his disciples were crucified upside down or thrown to the lions or boiled in oil or etc. And it's because they seek a country that is beyond this world. I think that the governing ethic of love guided by wisdom, therefore what do we do with the earth? That's a good way to pass the time here. But I think, if we're going to take the Bible as truth or prophetic, then there's a higher reality to seek that is beyond a sustainable earth.
Mhm.
So I don't know. What do you think about that? The contrast between the goal that you talked about and this. It's actually kind of it's a fuzzier goal because we don't really understand the kingdom of heaven. We don't understand necessarily what a divine existence is going to look like if we can bring it to pass, or if God has to do that, and it's a question of where do we fit when it happens, or I don't know. And what are your thoughts on that?
So I feel that I believe that I'm already experiencing that higher realm. And so like that, there's a part of me that's already godlike, experiencing that reality. And so, but the reason, like, if that's the case, then why even have a human to begin with? And so there's an experience, there's a set of experiences that need to be had here.
Okay.
And so that we will go through a transition, a change of being more connected to higher reality. That I believe will happen. I actually believe that I see it happening. So we are in a state of transition, and people are waking up. That people are getting more connected to their spirituality or higher selves, and that they're questioning a lot more than they used to when I was younger. And so, or maybe I'm more open to it now since I've died. But I'm witnessing it on a big scale. That like there's a lot of people that are getting more and more connected, and it's encouraging. And so that taking place, I believe we are going to transition, that we are going to become a different being than we currently are. That we are going to experience reality differently than we currently are,
Yeah.
and it will be elevated. And so, in that, the way that I end up seeing it is that will happen simultaneously, and in alignment with the need to still have experiences. And so I actually feel it and witness it as like I'm looking down a wormhole, but I'm also aware that there's like it's like an off ramp. So like we currently are on like timeline like highway, and then there's like this off ramp that is there's another highway, and that highway is like this other world that's what's kind of as far as I can see is that there's this other platform of existence that we've created. And I know that part of that is the ability to bottle light. Energy is no longer an issue. The whole thing is flying over the ocean. And so with that, then a lot of the things that plague us today don't exist. And so I can see it as that there's like this fork in the road that in order for that reality to take place, we have to be more in tune with a higher self, with a higher power in order to get in alignment with that future. Otherwise, it will be more of what is, and from what I can see, it doesn't necessarily have an uptick. It's kind of a degradation of humanity and life.
So to throw some Bible at that, which is what I've been doing, I think, this whole time.
Right?
Jesus said the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God does not come with observation. The kingdom is within you. And so it's like there is something really freaky about that concept. When he referred to himself as the Son of Man. And I think it's kind of an irony because he's the Son of God. And so he's like, the Son of Man. He said, the Son of Man, which is in heaven. He described himself as being in heaven when he was talking to people. And for a moment, it's like the veil was lifted and you see, oh, he's in heaven. That's weird. Like, how can you be in heaven and also on the earth? Mm-hmm. And maybe I should work on describing that with matrix math or something.
Well, and I experience it as so we're on Earth and we're experiencing this reality, and say that's a middle ground. However, like heaven is on Earth, hell is also on Earth. So we literally are living in heaven and hell simultaneously, and Earth all simultaneously, and it depends on our choices and how we perceive reality that leans us one direction or the other.
It's hard to disagree. Just practically speaking, it's like you're either on the path of carnality leading to death, or you're on the path of spiritual mindedness leading to righteousness and eternal life. The one who does the will of God abides eternally. But the one whose heart is connected to worldly things, he perishes when the earth perishes. And it could be that the reason the Bible is so hard to sort out sometimes is because it's all metaphorical in some sense. It's trying to describe higher realities that we can't relate to unless we've experienced it on some level. And so for those of us who have encountered the divine, we can talk about it. Oh yeah, the divine, the other realm, that other higher mode of existence where things suddenly matter and it's about experiences and love is an actual thing. And it casts shadows and the shadows look like somebody taking care of an orphan. And it's like, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But it's kind of like if you talk to somebody who's never tasted black licorice, the taste of black licorice.
Right.
How do you describe that?
Yeah, it is. It's really difficult. And so like in the second half of my book, I was trying to describe how that works in this reality. And so kind of like what is it like to be soul? And so you mentioned early on that there's left brain, right brain, emotional and analytical, right? And then we have the ruminating choose around in the back of your head. But if you take the two halves of your brain, I would ask, how often do you spend time in between the two halves of your brain. And so you can be emotional, you can be analytical, but how often do you spend time in that little fine line in between the two, in the little space between? And that's where the soul is. That's where we are able to actually exist and become soul. And so then I'm not emotional, I'm not ego, I am soul. I'm taking inventory of both sides, but I'm not getting into either side of the brain. I'm staying in the middle between the two.
Yeah. Well, without experiences that are qualitative, that sucked. That was awesome. You know, analytical is completely pointless. You know, set a computer to the task of, you know, examining every square inch of this table and giving like all the colors or making it. What would be the point? Unless it somehow enters into some experience that I can have that's qualitative, that has some quality to it of either sucks or awesome. And maybe, you know, I think that'd be a cool thing. Make the sucks awesome spectrum, you know, and put everything on it. And, you know, like I don't even want to start here.
Right? Yeah. Well, even then, it's all relative anyway.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, like you're saying, you have to have emotion and logic or analytical, and they have to come together, or emotion is chaos and logic is pointless.
Yeah.
You said that the way that you think now is different because of that experience you had.
Mhm.
And you talked about the realization that like you are not the ego, the emotion, or the roommate, and how that affects your day-to-day decisions.
Yep.
Can you talk? Did I just say the whole thing right there, or is there more you can say on that?
There's more there. And so I describe a methodology of so I know that I'm not my emotion. That is a tool that I have access to. It's like I have a whole side of the brain that I have access to but it's not me. And then I have a whole other side that's analytical that I have access to that's not me. And then I have a roommate that wanders around and it can wander around and shroud the emotions with opinions. And so you normally could say experience an emotion, but then there's this opinion or this judgment that's cast, and I describe it as like the roommate throws up this parachute, and now all of a sudden you can't see clearly the emotion for what it truly is. And then furthermore, the roommate will project up onto that parachute on the inside, like with a projector screen, like, hey, this is another reality that you could, should, or would experience if only this little thing was different. And that's actually making it so that you don't have to experience the emotion fully. And so the roommate kind of like masks and hides and represents the analog and the emotion and even the soul as best it can. And so it kind of runs around the brain and doesn't really have a place that it necessarily stays. But I do have mine where it's equated to the kind of behind me. And then there's the soul of like, I am none of those, and I'm going to be in the middle of myself. And that center is what I would call soul. And that's another perspective that if I'm connected to a higher self, still that soul is not who I am. That's another perspective that's actually outside of me. And I've only experienced this a couple times, but I've been able to have it to where my soul is outside of me, my other perspectives are outside of me, and I'm able to become them fast in sequence. And so it'll be soul, then emotion, then ego, and then soul, emotion, ego, and I just spin them around and I become each of them quickly, and then allow them to revolve around. And then the roommate is kind of in between if need be. I don't actually have to have the roommate as part of the revolution, but those other perspectives are necessary. And then I kind of get inside of that, and I've had it to where that spinning of, or that process of becoming the different perspectives, if I do it quickly enough, then that almost
Sorry.
that that is creating a a energetic swirl
Mhm.
almost. And so then that energetic swirl is able to kind of like push the chaos, and it creates a zone of tranquility, I call it. And so then I'm able to like push out this chaos to the point where like it's calm. And so it like say like being in the middle of a hurricane, there's an eye of the storm. And so it's like there's a storm raging all around, chaos is everywhere, and yet it's not getting me.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm in the middle of it somehow. And the only time that I've been able to experience that is when these perspectives are racing around me and I'm able to become them and let go. I'm soul and let go. Emotion, let go. Ego, let go. And then, like I experience them as fully as possible in the moment and then let them pass. And then it just gets processed. And so I described that what it looks like and how that feels. And then you have this zone of tranquility. But then inside of that zone of tranquility, there is a center, and I've been able to get into that center to the point where I'm looking out and on like the that dome, so to speak, of or where the zone of tranquility is pushing out the chaos. And so it's like moving energetic particles, and I'm able to like see something and that isn't out there, and it's like a reflection. And so then I'm able to see that, and it's like looking in a window. You can see through the window, but then there's also a reflection on the window. But then you can't look at the window pane itself to see it. You have to look outside in order to see what is actually in focus on being reflected by the pane. And so I've been able to see off of that event horizon this light. And that light looks like a delicate flame, and it's in a dark like cave. And so then like I like the zone of tranquility is like a cave, and then that light is like this delicate flame that I'm able to see in this mirror like reflection of this chaos moving around. And so then it's like these perspectives are outside of me creating that zone, but then there's this me that is inside of that. And so once I'm able to like find and become that flame burning inside, that inner light, then that's where I've gotten like that's like a signal to the universe or signal to God of like I'm centered, I'm balanced, and then God or my higher self is able to connect. And so I describe it as say like a bathtub. You pull the plug, and the water starts going down the drain, and the water's just cruising around the drain. And so that's like the perspectives, they're flowing, right? And you have this little cyclone that develops around the drain, and so then that cyclone touches the bottom, and it just is sitting there draining. But every once in a while it gurgles and air gets sucked into the drain. And that's what it's like. It's like God is actually touching, and you get a download, you get information. And so then what I'm doing is I'm having this revolution happening. I get centered, and I become that flame. And then all of a sudden, if I'm able to maintain it, then air gets gurgled into me, and I get a download. I get information that I wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. And it's very much higher self, God connection, and it's super overwhelming. And so it's like I can maintain it for a little bit, and then I get so much information that just it's overwhelming, and I end up losing it.
Yeah. I have experienced something similar, and when I experience like almost like a direct connection to God, I feel overwhelming compassion. Like I look at somebody and everything that they experience, I'm just horrifically aware of everything that others feel. And I just can't imagine like anything other than doing everything in my power to make sure that this person has life and joy and peace and good things. And there's also this simultaneous awareness of all of the pain and suffering and loss, and it's overwhelming, and I instantly like will burst into tears, and I just can't contain myself. It's just this sobbing, intense, overpowering, broken spirit of love, of people that can't be helped. And in those moments, I also have, like you say, awareness, knowledge. I know about things that are going to happen. I know about things that there's no way I could know about this person. And I've acted on it sometimes too, where it's like, you're going through these things right now, or this random lady in a restaurant, and I'm like, your husband's in another state, and he's going through an identity crisis right now. And she's like, how do you know that? I don't know, because I'm connected to God, I guess. It's just like I can see it, just like I could see that you're wearing a white shirt. So it's crazy, and it's like, this is real. This is a real thing that's happening, and
Right.
Jesus is probably the perfect picture of what that's supposed to look like, where he's perfectly connected to the divine, he's connected to the Father, and he sees everything, and he's living out this compassion without compromise. And he takes that all the way to the cross, obviously. And there's this really disturbing thing that seems to be true, that you have to become that in order to inherit eternal life. Otherwise, you're going to get pushed off the cliff, and you're going to get lost in the void. The chaos of, all of these souls that are sort of mixed together, who sort of lose themselves. And maybe what you saw is a picture of hell. And maybe all of the descriptions of hell in the Bible are sort of metaphorical. They're trying to depict something that is, maybe beyond a perfect analogy, beyond a perfect metaphor. And of course, if what we're talking about here is true, that has huge implications for all the people who are convinced that, yep, I have eternal life. I go to the right church.
Mm-hmm.
I have the right set of doctrines. When you mention, becoming aware of the different versions of you, I tend to think that the roommate is probably a demon. No offense.
I don't think I would equate it that way. But there is definite conflict.
Yeah. There's a guy named Derek Prince who he did a lot of, he calls it Deliverance Ministry, basically helping people who are demon possessed. And so much of the things that he says as he's talking about this sound so similar to some of the things that you're saying when you describe the roommate and when you describe experiences. So he would say, a spirit of alcoholism. Well, if the world passes away and everything that's in it passes away, then drinking alcohol may not exist anymore. So a spirit that is purely the desire to drink alcohol has no place to exist, or has no place where it can find satisfaction in a world where alcohol doesn't exist. And according to him, the demon of alcoholism, which he describes as like this other entity that is aware of itself and is having experiences that are qualitative, that either they're somewhere on the suck to awesome scale. I hate this, I want this. It wants to be drinking the alcohol, and it needs a body to do that. And so it has to hijack your body in order to be able to experience what it desires, and it will do everything that it can in order to gain power over you so that it can experience alcoholism through your body. When that happens, it's hijacked your senses, it's in control, and you no longer get to be part of that experience. It takes over. That seems like what might be happening with the roommate.
Yeah, I could agree with that. But I wouldn't necessarily call it demon, but there's a part of self that we become. And so there are people that are very much emotionally driven, and they like reside in that. And then there are people that are very much analytical, ego-based, we call it egotistical, right? That you could really take it to an extreme, and that's where they reside. But then you have people, and then the roommate is all over the place. And so that roommate it casts its opinions and judgments on top of these other perspectives, these other methods of being. And it does kind of dictate to us a different method of being, and we a different reality that's a potential. And so, do we follow that or not? What is that desire? How does that affect us? And I would say that the roommate does have a life of its own.
Mhm.
And what we do is we, um, I've had this ability to become the roommate, and so like I'm not the emotion, I'm not the ego, I am the roommate. I am opinionated, I am judgmental, and so when I become that, then I'm not definitely not my soul. I'm definitely not centered and balanced. I'm definitely not emotional or following my ego. These things might actually play a role, but I am definitely um, this other self, this imagined reality, this imagined being, and it's very much imperfect. It's malnourished and kind of contorted, and like it's just not whole.
Mhm.
But I think that society actually pushes us to the limits, and where we to find solace, we use the roommate and become the roommate in order to exist in the paradigm that we have created. And so it's like, well, if I'm a roommate and I'm existing and that's working for whatever reason in society, then you have to be your roommate in order to fit into that construct. And so everybody's running around as the roommate, and nobody's running around as soul. Everybody else, and then there are some people that get on the fringes and they're like, okay, well, I'm just going to be emotional or I'm going to just be ego. But the vast majority of us are stuck because of the social programming to rely on our roommate. And we have a whole judicial system that like is literally all about being a judge. And so if you have your opinions as a jury, you have the judgment from a judge. Like our whole society is based on this kind of representation of humanity. And so we rely upon our roommate, and all those people have to click in to the roommate in order to have their opinions, in order to pass judgment. And so like we've created this paradigm that is roommate based. And without it, then like you're abnormal. And so I'm like, all right, I'm going to go against the grain and say I have access to it, and I'm not going to just like carve it out of my being and say it doesn't exist. Or like there are some people that like New Age, like having an ego death. And so somehow you can divorce yourself from your ego. And I'm like, go ahead and try that. But like my ego is my friend. It's a tool that I have access to. I don't want to carve it out of my being. And likewise, my emotions. I don't want to carve that out of my being. I want to use them.
The roommate. I've had this experience of encountering a spirit. It's like there's this other entity, and it wants something. What does it want? Well, let's see. And then, like I talked about earlier, the spirit appears to me when I'm in my prayer, and it's wanting to shake my hand, and I'm really reluctant, and I say some prayers, and I get the sense that I should shake its hand. And when I do, it immediately like takes me on the journey of what it wants to get, and I realize it's a spirit, an entity that is pure lust. And it's like, oh, well, that's kind of a gross thing, and I'm convinced that there's an infinite number of things like that. There could be something that just wants everything to be purple, so let's paint it purple, and
Right.
if you can imagine a reality where things are different, then there's a spirit that might want to create that reality.
Do you draw a distinction between biology and spirit? Like at what point is it just the hardware?
I don't know, it's
versus
kinda like-
the software.
The difference between water and wetness, I think there is the hardware, and I think there is the software, just like a computer. But I don't know that you can have life without the spirit and the biology, at least life in the sense of biological life.
Mhm. Well, like when is it a spirit and when is it just that we have a like we have a fight, flight, food, and fornication part of our brain, and that's that's allowed part of the hardware versus there's actually an extra dimensional thing that is You know, where's the difference between the hardware working and the multi-dimensional?
Well, what
how
I
it
see
works?
when I relax and look is freaky, but I think that when you have like hunger,
Mhm.
there is a spirit that is like tied into your physical body. The physical body is like a system of sensors, basically. I don't know how else to describe it. That communicates to you that you need food, and then the spiritual life living thing feels that desire, and it compels you. So there is a spirit of hunger that's not necessarily demonic or evil. It's just there. Um, and if you are aware of it, like, you suddenly were separated and realized you are not the roommate, you are not the analytical self, you are not the emotion, you are something else, and you can see these things and you can tell that they are voices. The person who is entirely a slave to their carnality, what the body tells them that they need, is a person who is living in an unsustainable way. But I think that it is possible to recognize there's a spirit of hunger and for it to be cast out, and it could do some weird things to you. Like if you don't have a sense of the need to eat. I think that there are certain spirits that are just purely evil, and there are other spirits that are more like neutral, um, and there are certain spirits that can only be good. And I say that because something like eating, well, eating is not necessarily evil, but the person who like eats another person's face off would be somebody who is unconstrained. It's like hunger without constraint is a zombie. Eat your brains. Seriously.
Mm.
So you have to have wisdom governing the hunger. And if that hierarchy switches, then it's like, oh, there's a person's face. I could eat that. And I mean, seriously, that's the zombie. And you hear of the guy who was on bath salts and tried to eat somebody's face or something. And it's like, I think that's what's going on. When it comes to like the evil spirits, I will, like I said, I can just watch. I can see like there's a dark cloud moving across the room, hits that person in the chest, and as soon as I see that happen, the person's like, oh. And you see the person like contemplating something. Pretty soon they're up and they're doing something weird. I think that it's going on all the time. I think that it's as complicated as a computer that has 100 different kinds of software running on it, and it's just it's crazy. I remember the first time I saw this, I thought about how goofy it is when somebody says you shouldn't be looking for a demon behind every bush, because there are not nearly enough bushes. There's just so much going on. It's so incredibly complicated. And the exercise of taking every thought captive is important because it's kind of like we're in a jungle all the time that's filled with myriads of weird spirits that could just suddenly come in. And hey, wouldn't it be cool if like everybody in this room knew how smart you were? And you're like, there's this marketing strategy. The spirit comes to you and here's its marketing strategy. Wouldn't it be cool if? And you're like, yeah. And then suddenly you start doing things to become the center of attention. And then everybody's like, what is that guy's problem? Pretty soon you've alienated all these people and you're like, what was going on there? And then the next time that spirit comes along, wouldn't it be great if like everybody in the room knew how awesome you were? And you're like, I remember the last time I did this. So I think it's complicated. I think it's like we are warring constantly with just myriads of different spirits that are telling us the most important thing is to eat. The most important thing is to screw. The most important thing is to be the center of attention. The most important thing is to make money. And they're just everywhere, like mosquitoes or bugs. Or, they're just flying around all the time. You have to be aware of it. So when you talk about the roommate, I think, well, you're lucky you only have one.
Yeah, I think that, so to kind of answer your question from my perspective, I don't necessarily think that there's like spirits running around that are like that, but there are influences. And so say like if I have a roommate that I have become and I have my opinions and judgments, and then I can use my ego to like actually make those a reality. I wouldn't say that, say, my roommate or the ego or the emotions are spirits. They're just, it's kind of like part of the hardware, right? You know, or the software, I guess. They like, those are programs that I'm able to run and utilize. And then so that's kind of like a biological thing that we're able to, like, we're born with a soul, and that's a spirit, and then over time we learn emotion, and that's, we've developed a program, and then we've learned ego, and we've developed a program, and then eventually we have a roommate that's a whole nother program, and it's a mature one. It is a mature program that is like able to access a lot more of the previous programs.
Mm-hmm.
To me, your structure sounds, the way I think about it is that we have our reptilian brain, our mammalian brain, and our human brain in kind of that ascending order. And so our reptilian brain is the fight, flight, food, and fornication, and that's kind of emotion. And then there's our mammalian brain, which is our ego. It's our ability to associate as an I and a me in between us. And then we have our prefrontal cortex, which is the judging, the conceptualization, the deep thought, and the past, the future, and relating them all together. So when I hear you saying that description, I'm hearing our three brains kind of communicating together. And the soul is really, so if that's the hardware running programs, the soul is the person sitting at the machinery.
Right. Yeah,
So,
it's the witness.
exactly, yes. So
Yeah,
we have
and
the
so-
hardware running software, and then the soul is the user
Right.
using the actual
Yeah.
piece of machinery.
Yeah, and that would be the spirit.
Right.
You know,
The language of the Bible is interesting here. It says, "Do not yield to the lusts of the flesh, but yield to the Spirit of God." And the Spirit of God would be that love thing that you experienced. And once you've encountered that, and when you're connected to God, and you feel that compassion for others, you can yield to that. And so it's like you're sitting over the Spirit of God and the spirit of the world, or the spirit of greed, or the pride of life, or whatever, something the Bible would describe as carnality or sin, the reptilian brain. And you get to decide what you yield to. So it's like free will is pretty limited from a strictly biblical perspective, especially if you go into the Old Testament and look at the parts of the physical reality that God takes credit for, and the parts that he holds man accountable for. It's pretty easy to make a biblical argument that free will only gives us the ability to look at the different spirits that are pulling us in different directions, reason to where it's going to go, and then decide which one to yield to. And then how it plays out is actually something that God remains sovereign over. So in some sense, I'm saying that I think maybe free will really is just the ability to evaluate the different spirits and decide which one we want to yield to, or the different desires, if you will, or different poles, or whatever.
Okay.
Call them spirit, call them the reptilian brain, call them the Spirit of God, call them whatever you want. The Bible uses the word spirit kind of ubiquitously to, is that even a word? Can I make ubiquitous an adverb?
Right.
In a ubiquitous way to describe anything that when it is in you, it compels you. And
Okay.
yeah, so you have a spirit of jealousy, and then suddenly you're suspicious, and I think the wife is cheating on me, and just describes it, says the spirit of jealousy comes upon a person.
All right.
Or the love of money would be a kind of spirit, and when it possesses you, it causes all of these things to happen, and all these other spirits are branches of that kind of a thing. But in the Greek word is pneuma, which is the same as for air, and it's because, as near as they can tell, it's kind of like air. It seems to come out when a person dies. It seems to be able to like go into somebody, like the wind just blew on that person and suddenly they were jealous. And in the Hebrew, it's the same thing. It's ob or something like that, and it refers to like the sound of blowing on something. And so there's this equating it with air because that's the nearest analogy. But yeah, just kind of lump sums all of those things into the word spirit.
Right.
So yeah, as you're reading the Bible, and they talk about that, we might have all these terms for it. Bible just kind of thinks of it as a spirit, and when you're casting out evil spirits, it's like you're recognizing this person has a spirit of jealousy, or a spirit of greed, or a spirit of anger, or a spirit of whatever. And when that thing is present, it makes them behave a certain way and seek a particular thing. And in order to cast it out, they have to be set free by essentially having a paradigm shift. The spirit of greed makes you want money, might make you cheat on your taxes or steal or lie or do other devious kinds of things because money is so important. And in order to be set free from the love of money, the Bible says, it is written, I will never leave you nor forsake you, but I will provide all of your needs as far as your food and clothes and shelter, etc. Therefore, let your character be entirely free from the spirit of greed or the love of money. So the promise of God for provision is the paradigm shift you need to have in order to recognize the spirit of greed and say, no, you're not going to control me, and put that aside. And then the whole process of discipleship, becoming like Christ, is kind of like confronting all of your inner demons and evaluating them against the things that Jesus revealed and either saying yea or nay. No, I don't need you. You are not Christ-like. You're going to drag me down into this world away from the divine. I want to be connected to the divine because the divine is the only thing that's sustainable beyond the world, beyond death, etc.
Right. So then I guess earlier you mentioned that the roommate would be synonymous with a demon. And I guess in that description, I would be able to agree that there's these spirits that you're calling them that are able to drag you down and get your attention or become something within you that affects you. And that's the roommate does that, right? It's within you and it affects you and it influences how you move through life, and it pulls you away from your divine, or rather your soul. And so then are you able to sit in that space between that is the soul? And in most cases we get pulled off, and the roommate, or that those thoughts that become actions and influence us in a lot of ways negatively. It's pulling us off of that divine knowing, that divine being that I would describe as being soul and centered.
Well, and it's, I don't know, this is probably an incomplete picture, but you talk about the meaning of life being related to the ability to have experiences, and these other entities that the Bible describes as basically spirits without bodies, and that these spirits, their desires are based in carnal things, and so they need to use your body to satisfy the desires that they have. That picture seems to be useful. It seems to be true to life. And you see somebody who is overcome by these things, it's like they die. Suddenly they can't taste. Suddenly they can't appreciate beauty. Suddenly things become meaningless, and they get depressed, and it's like they're dying on the inside, and it's because something else has basically hijacked their ability to experience and starting to replace them, and they become sort of smaller and smaller. And I've known people who are completely overcome. It's like they spend a good portion of their life as what they would describe as missing time, where they look at their phone and they have sent all kinds of horrific texts to people, and they have no memory of doing it. And it's because the roommate had taken over so thoroughly that they were unconscious, and they're fighting to just come up for air, sort of. Most of their life is governed by this other entity.
Right.
Well, we should probably wrap it up.
Sounds good. Yeah, and that's, I guess, kind of to bring it back, that like you said, that there's something that's dragging you down, and those people are just barely coming up for air. There's the point where, okay, so now you've come up for air, you're able to maintain that, and then at some point, are you able to rise? And so at where you left the roommate behind, you've left those demons, and they might still play a role within you, but they don't influence you any longer. And at that point, then by becoming soul, or getting in alignment with that and who you truly are and the divine, then say the title of the book, Walking on the Ocean of Life. So instead of being underwater and having the sensation of drowning, or even swimming for that matter, having the ability to rise and seemingly walk on water.
It's, I think, maybe the biggest takeaway from this conversation should be the realization that that thing that you're feeling is not you. Your hunger is not you. Your lust is not you. Your reptilian brain is not you. It's a voice. And to connect to the divine, I think it's to be aware. My stomach says I should eat. Is it true, or should I do something different? And then the person who is entirely a creature of instinct, an animalistic type person, that part of them that can recognize my hunger is over here, it's a voice. My thirst is over here, it's a voice. My anger is over here, it's a voice. My desire for money is over here, it's a voice. All of these things, and to look at them and evaluate them, I think that's a divine capacity. I think that's something that only divine beings can do. And I think that you have to have the Spirit of God awaken you, or whatever that thing is when God breathed his spirit into man and he became a living soul.
Right.
I think another way of saying that is being aware that all these desires are not you, and deciding which ones you think are going to lead you to the right place.
Right. Yep. Agreed.
Cool. We agreed on something.
Right. Yeah. That's a good note to end on, right?
All right. Cool. And again, your book is Walking on the Ocean of Life.
Yep. Walking on the Ocean of Life. Leifryan Petite Kirkpatrick.
Leifryan Petite Kirk. Yeah. I'll go with that.
Cool.
Yep. All right. Cool.
Thank you.
The end.